Thank you very much, Dave, for sitting down to actually talk with me. That's
No problem.
so. I guess the first question is, how was quarantine for you, and how did it affect your writing? Did you write anything new, or were you meant to go to events that got cancelled?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I feel I feel privileged that as a writer, my working life was disrupted in that I spent a lot of time going to schools and going to libraries and doing events. So I think I had maybe 40 or 50 cancellations. And that was obviously like a blow, but at the same time, like you can't argue with it. Like, what can you do? It's just, a lot of people were, so much more worse off than me. In terms of writing, then, yeah, I mean, I think it's impossible for it not to affect you in some way. At the time, I was writing another collection of Doctor Who short stories, which is out in October. And even though I was, with each story, escaping to a different world or a different time or different characters, you can't get away from the news cycle and the world that you're in. So it was. There was a lot of talk at the start of this. It's like, oh, now's the time to write your novel. And it's like, no, it's really difficult to be optimistic and upbeat and creative when like it feels like the world is on fire. But deadlines are very helpful in that regard. So the book got finished and I'm now working away on a new one, which is very exciting. And so it did affect me. I'm lucky in that I have a little office in my house with my wife, and so I had somewhere that I could go to write, which made things easier. I really feel for people who, I have a lot of friends who work in tech and are like, sitting at a laptop in a small apartment with their partner, also sitting at the same small table. And so I was lucky I had a bit of space to retreat to. So it was difficult in places, but I know how fortunate I am that like I could do a lot of my work from home, basically.
And do you think that, like, just in your house, having a small space just to yourself, would you find you work better in places by yourself, or would you find it better to go to like a coffee shop and write?
It's a funny one. It can be different, basically. A huge part for me of like the writing process or the going from being somebody who wanted to be a writer to someone who wrote every day for a living is figuring out how things work for you, and also figuring out when you need to change your situation. So I swore to myself I'd never be one of those people, one of those writers who gets up at 7 a.m. and is really like smug about it on Twitter. All those people who are like, oh, I got up at 6 and I have my whole day done by 9, and like whatever. But I do get, I am at my desk by like 8:30 in the morning, and I generally will try and do 1,000 words, which is usually my daily sort of word count. And like, if I start early and I keep at it, I stay off Twitter, I can usually get that done by like 11:30 or 12, and the rest of the day is emails or admin or online events. If this wasn't COVID times, I love to go to cafes or libraries or restaurants because I do like the change of scenery. I like the fact that if you're going to be one of those jerks who sits with their computer and their headphones, you really have to be doing something, otherwise you are just being performative. And so when I go to a local cafe for a couple of hours, or now an hour and 5 minutes or whatever it is, I really feel I have to do work, because otherwise what was the point of lugging my laptop in and finding somewhere close to a plug and all that. So, but also what's been very important is learning when the transitionary period should be. So learning when, okay, you've been banging your head off this same paragraph for an hour, instead of doing that for another hour, get out, go for a walk. I've learned to kind of recognize my own tolerances. Okay, this is when I need a walk. This is when I need to go die a lot in Dark Souls. This is when I need to change up the music I'm listening to, but also stay at my desk. And like being stuck at home, because normally I would do a lot of my writing on trains, or I would do it on my phone running between 2 different events or whatever. Now I'm really had to examine my process, because I've been either trapped in this room or I have only very limited ways of getting out. And so it has been like like, you know that thing when you put yourself in the right mood to work by like cleaning your room or whatever? At
Yep.
least that's what I tell myself I'm doing.
Yeah.
I've had to get really good at knowing when to, okay, now is the time we can get some work in. Now you need to change it up, but you need to get back to your desk.
So you write mostly like fantasy books and books about sort of other worlds. How did you get into that?
So I am a big nerd. No, it's a funny one. I was always, as a kid and as a young person, I read a lot, but I was always more drawn to fantasy and science fiction and speculative fiction because I come from a tiny village in Cavan, and I would keep myself going by imagining a weirder world overlaid on mine. So like a lot of my childhood was spent imagining like painting over dragons and wars and magic and all over the sort of backdrop of the idyllic backdrop of rural Cavan, and that is what I've been sort of drawn to my entire life. Now, when I first started writing, I guess, well, when I first started writing, I wrote fan fiction because I was learning how to write, and so I would use other people's characters or other people's settings and other people's tone, and that was really useful. When I started sort of submitting to journals and sort of the in-between phase between writing for fun and getting an agent and writing novels, my in-between phase was, it's different for everybody, but for me it was like poetry and short fiction. And I did try writing normal stuff. Like I wrote, sad stories about sad young men, because that's what I was. And I enjoyed it. And there's a lot I spent a long time being kind of snobby about sort of literary fiction where there's no dragons and nothing happens. But because every fiction sort of has its own area of expertise. So like crime stuff, the best for pacing, horror stuff, the best for suspense, fantasy, the best for world building. And with literary fiction, because there is less of an emphasis on plot, shall we say, that's when they really get into like language and character. And so I did learn a lot from doing that, but it's just not where my heart was. And when I was studying the creative writing masters in UCD, one of our first assignments was to write the first chapter of a novel. And I left at the very last minute because I'm an idiot. And I wrote the first chapter of Nights of, I don't have a copy of it anyway, Nights of the Borrowed Dark, my first novel, in like 2 hours. I was actually doing NaNoWriMo, my friend Deirdre Sullivan, who's a fantastic YA author who you should all should read. And because I had no time to try and sound smarter than I was, I just wrote the kind of thing I would have liked to read. And that's kind of what I've done ever since. So like for me, I love fantasy and science fiction because it's a chance to take the theme of your book or the central challenge your character is facing and give it a voice and make it walk around. So if your book is about, if your main character's thing is a fear of death or an obsession with death, you can just put a vampire in there and they can symbolize that. If, as in Nights, the theme is how anger and pain can be useful as if it's channeled into creating and empathy and helping, but it can be destructive if you don't, I can just invent a form of magic that does that. So it's a way of being really obvious and blatant and sort of pyrotechnically honest about what your themes are, which is what I like. Also, it's just fun. It's just more fun to write about like time travel and sword fights and things like that.
So is fantasy still what you would mostly read, or do you read sort of more broad, a more broad range of books now?
Fantasy and horror and sci-fi are usually my go-to, but I will say that every time I've like clipped myself across the back of the head and said, try and read something outside your comfort zone, I've always been rewarded for it. So like I'll always be at home reading, Laini Taylor or Leigh Bardugo or Sarah Maria Griffin or any of these people. But when I've sort of decided to go a little bit further and read some like Mike McCormick or read like some Sarah Baum or other literary fiction, um, that's always turned out to be a good idea. And so I think you can, everyone needs their comfort food, particularly in the middle of like a global pandemic.
Yeah.
But the challenge has always paid off in the end, basically.
So you were talking about how most of your like very intricate stories about fantasy and all that are loosely based around where you grew up in rural Cavan. So do you think having those kind of very normal settings are very important in fantasy?
I do. I think that for me, I find that the putting something fantastical beside something mundane makes the fantastical look more fantastical. It's just your color contrast. So like for me, I'm like, look, maybe some authors do, but I generally don't think about sort of those kind of like themes and things like that while I'm first maybe plotting a story. I'm led by kind of plot and character first. And then, but the funny thing is, it's only afterwards that like I realize that the themes are coming through in my writing all the same. So when I wrote Nights of the Borrowed Dark, a huge part of Nights is the fact that the monsters, these extra dimensional shapeshifters, are viewed as the enemy because they come from somewhere else, but in actuality are incredibly complicated and incredibly have, you know, diverse and strange motivations and aren't this united front that we should mistrust. And somebody said to me, like, you know, maybe a couple of years afterwards, oh, was that influenced by growing up beside like the border of Northern Ireland? And like, you know, when I was a kid going to visit my granny in Fermanagh, like you had to like, when you were crossing the border, you had to like get out of your car because there were the guys with guns who would like search the car going through the border pass, whatever. And that's not what I intended, but it's obviously in influencing the way that I think. And so because I suppose I was a very shy kid and I was always sort of in the background, my eye is always on the background. So my characters are never the kind of people who are front and center in things. So, you know, my main character, Denizen in Nights, suffers very badly from anxiety, second guesses everything, is very, very mistrustful, and can't even enjoy the good parts of the terrible adventure that I set him on. And I will always try and put those, like I feel like, especially when you write fantasy, you know, the setting and the magic and all that can be as fantastic as you want, but if the people aren't real, no one's going to care. So and like you see that a lot with the Doctor Who that I write, is because like that is really, you know, it's far from Cav and all that stuff kind of happens and stuff, but I still have to have like a real person there, because otherwise it's just light and color and so it doesn't matter.
100%, yeah. So if you could give like advice to a young person who's maybe interested in starting to write a fantasy novel, I know I've tried many times when I was a bit younger, and it can be very difficult to even just start. So what advice would you give to someone who doesn't even know where to start?
So what I would say is every book will have multiple, what you'll call at the time false starts, but they're not false starts because you're learning something. The more words you put on the page, the more you learn. Whether or not any of them end up in the final book, nothing you do that moves you closer to writing is wasted time. So whether you're reading lots of fantasy but haven't put, and that is extremely important, that's like the base level thing. If you want to write in a genre, you have to know about that genre, so you can know what stories have already been told. You can maybe like see gaps in what the stories people aren't telling. So reading is fundamental. Reading is your first step. After that, I would always tell somebody that your first draft is for nobody but you. Your first draft is not for, don't second guess yourself by jumping down the line and worrying what a publisher might think of it, or an agent, or even your friends or your family. Just tell the story that got you interested and excited in the first place. follow your instincts. If you're writing a chapter and you think it's kind of boring, get to the end and keep going, because you can always go back and fix those things later. But there is nothing more important than writing things down and writing like a messy first draft, because it's really, really hard to both write and edit. And if you're writing a first draft, and this is what I'm doing at the minute, I am not letting myself go back and second guess. I'm not letting myself edit. Is most of this first draft trash? Absolutely. But it is not my job to work on that yet. All I am doing is getting a first draft down, because then once it's down and I've written the ending, I have learned so much about that book and about that world that I'm trying to create. And I know a version of the ending, which means when I go back to do a second draft, some of my work is done. And I no longer need, okay, I got 10% of the book right. Great. Second draft, I'm only worrying about 90%. Third draft, 50%. Like, if you only ever write one chapter and spend the rest of your life trying to make that chapter perfect, you will never write a chapter 2. Because what if that chapter 2 makes chapter 1 obsolete? Get to the end, because then that part of yourself, like, I mean, maybe you've only been writing, 3 or 4 years or a year, or you're just starting, but you've been reading and consuming story through video games and movies and TV your entire life. So in your second draft, your job is not to create, it's to assess. It's to read the book like a reader and go, that's actually not bad. Oh, this bit's terrible, it needs to go. Whereas if you're doing that in the first draft when you don't even know the ending and you're trying to put words down but also take them out, you'll just frustrate yourself. So so my steps are: read lots. I get excited, sorry. Read lots.
Yep.
Write the first draft just for yourself. Do not worry about plot holes. Do not worry about the strength of your world building, which is very important in fantasy but can be fixed later. Just get to the ending. If you realize, for example, at chapter 10, oh, I really want to go back and change my main character's name, put a note. Don't go back and change it. Because what if you get to chapter 15 and you want to change it again? So get to that end of that messy first draft that will be covered in notes of like, be better, change this, add this. Then do all of that in a second draft and keep doing that, because each time you redraft, there'll be less and less to fix. Does that make sense?
Perfect, yeah.
Cool.
So you talk about your character in your book, Knights of the Bardark. Do you write mostly, or when you get ideas for things that you're planning on writing, do you usually get ideas for more of like a world, or would you get more character ideas, or maybe both?
It's a weird mix, and a big part of why I say write the first draft is because that will let you start to connect a lot of these disparate elements that actually may not be that disparate or may not be that different. So for Knights, I had 3 sort of central ideas that kicked it off. One was I really wanted to write about an anxious, sarcastic, pick holes in everything teenager, because I was the kind of kid who always saw the bad side of things. And if someone showed up and was like, do you want magic? I'd be like, oh, what's the catch? Don't, please leave me alone. And so that was one thing. That was a character. I also had this idea for creating villains who didn't have some big, giant, massive, clever plan, but instead were just petty and cruel and were functionally bullies. I was bullied when I was a kid, and I wanted to explore that in a sort of a safe way by creating bullies, watching them kind of run around and examining them from every angle in kind of a safe setting. And then sort of the third sort of angle on it was I wanted to write something that was kind of, I guess the voice in it was respectful of young people, in that it didn't, you meet a lot of authors and you meet a lot of people in general who think that writing for young people means simplifying stuff and dumbing things down. I really resent that. And so I wanted to write a book that was sort of challenging in terms of its language and in terms of its characters and things like that. And they're like 3 quite separate things. But when I started to write, having the character face those monsters, having them do so in a tone and a voice that was a little bit demanding, all started to weave together. And so other weird extra ideas I had all started to like make sense once I connected them. But it was like, it's a bit like dumping a jigsaw out and sort of arranging the pieces a little bit before you put them together. Writing the first draft helped me figure out, okay, that makes sense. It also helped me figure out which ideas didn't make sense. I have a character, Habitus Frond, that I've been trying to make work for like 5 books now, but he just doesn't. I have this great idea about him, but like I put him into a book and then I look at the second draft and I'm like, yeah, he doesn't need to be there. I have to lop him off. So like, I generally have no idea how some ideas will come to me in the form of characters, as some of them will come to me in terms of I'll be given a brief by my publisher. So with Doctor Who, for my last Doctor Who book, they were like, write a story about each different villain, and that's a really simple sort of, that's like your teacher giving you like a finish the sentence or whatever. It's okay, so Cyberman, what would I do with that, and so on. But like it could come from anywhere, you know, and so you have to kind of be open to anything, but be able to maybe take some of your other ideas and start like melding them together and see what happens.
So you're obviously writing books. How did you get involved in writing Doctor Who novels?
So I got involved in Doctor Who by being a huge nerd. It's the answer to a lot of my questions. Basically, I was at a dinner 5 years ago, whenever Nights came out. No, early 2016, so 4 years ago. God. And I was, it was a dinner with my publisher and with, you know, different people in publishing. And the person I was sitting beside was in charge of all the Doctor Who stuff for Puffin. And she said, I think we were talking about Doctor Who possibly. And she's like, oh, you know, I run all those Doctor Who books. And I was like, oh, right, cool. She's like, would you ever like, and my publisher, my editor leaned across and was like, not until he's finished the Nights books. And I completely forgot about it. But I do a really shameful thing where I talk a lot about what I love in interviews, because you never know who's listening. This is really bad. Actually, it's not bad and you should do it as well. But like, after the third Nights book came out, I got a call from my agent and she was like, you like Doctor Who, don't you? And I was like, I love it. I love it with my tiny ginger heart. And she was like, oh, do you want to write this anthology of short stories for them? And I was really excited. And then she said, can you do it in 3 months? And I was like, yes. And she was like, but can you actually? And I was like, tell them I said yes, because I'm a chancer, and we'll see what happens. And I did, and it was good. And I wore grey in my beard because it was very stressful. But I was just kind of, I've always loved tie-in fiction because I'm a fan fiction person at heart. And that was just an opportunity to sort of like get in there and do my little cover band version of what I think the Doctor is. And that was really exciting. And it's funny, like I was told, one of the reasons I stopped writing fan fiction was because I had heard that like, there's no way, writing fan fiction is pointless. There's no, you're never going to get anywhere if all you do is write fan fiction. And now the epigram, the quote, the dedication at the start of my new Doctor Who book is, this is dedicated to anybody who's ever told writing fan fiction is a waste of time, because writing is never a waste of time and you never know who's listening. So keep writing, I guess.
We've all been locked in our houses for a very long time now. And have you found that useful in way of inspiration? Either by the news or by just little things that have been happening to you. Have you found it interesting to explore in inspiration wise?
That's an interesting question. I have found the sort of the era that we're living in, it's definitely had an effect on me. Like, I definitely find that I am now more, not that I always kept kind of one eye on politics and stuff, but like, I suppose I didn't, until the last few years, I wouldn't be as aware as I am now of things. Now I would be very, very interested and that has led me to do more research and do much more reading. And you know, it's a real privilege to be able to ignore politics in the year that we're living in. And now I definitely find that, like, I am, over the last few years, I've become more and more sort of aware and try to be more conscious of things I don't know about, and things like that. With Corona in particular, it's definitely made me like realize things I would have previously took for granted. So like, I do a lot of live events, and I just cannot see a future for the next while when I can say to a school, let's pack 300 young people in so I can yell at them about books. I mean, I feel that, like, I'm very lucky that I had the few years where I've done 604 events in the last like 3 years, and including with you guys, and they've been brilliant, and I don't know when those will happen again. So that's been, I've had to sort of change. You know, we've all become very good at Zoom in the last while and stuff. So in terms of inspiration, I don't think I'd ever write something. I've written stories where there are plagues, and written stories about things like that, but not, I think it's all too new. I'm still processing everything that's happening. And one thing that is showing up a lot in the book that I'm writing at the minute, which is a proper like otherworld fantasy. It's about a 15-year-old girl who can raise the dead, called Sister Wake, and she's like a mercenary necromancer. But she is living in the middle of a period of vast upheaval and rebellion and revolution. And I don't think that's an accident, even though it has nothing to do with, I wouldn't feel comfortable writing about something as fresh and as affecting so many people as COVID, but definitely the feeling of constant idling dread that we all feel at the minute, that tone and that sense is very much in the books. And the feeling of uncertainty and the feeling of being a young person growing up, having really no idea what the future will hold. And it's not that I sat down intentionally and was like, time to like inject some dread. But I don't think there's a way you could write about that now without, it's in everything, you know, like even like the amount of times I've written the phrase, hope you're keeping well in this weird time, in emails of the last while, like you can't get away from it.
No. Perfect. Well, that's all the questions I have for you. And obviously from all of us, congratulations to you and your wife on your upcoming child.
Yes. Thank you very much. The upcoming child. Yeah, I wish I like, give me like 1 second. I thought I knew how the world worked, but look how small clothes can be. It's ridiculous. Yeah, it is. We're very excited. This is sort of the last like couple of weeks before I disappear on paternity leave, and just very excited to be a bit like, I mean, I like to be a dad. I mean, I already wear cardigans and make terrible jokes, but yeah, it's going to be good. Thank you very much. That means a lot. Cheers.
Yeah, so thank you very much for sitting down with me.